Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Catherine Federowitz. I've been involved with the festival since its start 7 years ago. And to say that I'm beyond proud of what it's grown into is an understatement. Before we begin the session with Safiya Sinclair and Dr. Tamara Butler, I wanted to take a moment to shout out the nearly 150 students that are joining us today from Marvin Ridge High School in North Carolina. One of the aims of the festival is to promote and foster a love of reading, learning, and creativity. My father, Walter Federowitz, festival board chair, and one of the festival founders, has a deep passion for education. Raised by a single immigrant mother, his education was made possible through academic scholarships and the perseverance of his hardworking mother. So the continued attendance of Marvin Ridge students and all students is particularly close to our hearts, as is the Young Student Writers Awards that the festival launched this year, started by Jen Comer and further supported by Patty Manigault. As a token of our appreciation and a nod to the importance of education, the Federowitz Family Fund, in tandem with Patty Manigault, has gifted each Marvin Ridge student here today a copy of Safiya Sinclair's inspiring memoir, How to Say Babylon. Students, could you do us a favor and hold up your books, please, for a little photo op? Hold on. How to Say Babylon is a story about perseverance, about finding your voice and your passion and overcoming obstacles. So students, if there's one thing we'd like you to focus on, it's finding your own voices and your own direction. I now welcome Deborah Kennedy Kennard to kick off the event. Enjoy the session.
Thank you, Catherine. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to day 5 of the Charleston Literary Festival and our second day at the historic Dock Street Theater. First, I'd like to ask everyone to please silence your cell phones and other noise-making devices. As you heard, my name is Deborah Kennedy Kennard. I'm a member of the Board of Directors of the Charleston Literary Festival, and I have the distinct pleasure and honor of introducing our next speaker, Safiya Sinclair. However, I must admit that I found it virtually impossible in 2 to 3 minutes to adequately describe who Safiya Sinclair is. But I'll share a few facts. She's 39 years old. She was born in 1984 in Montego Bay, Jamaica. She's an associate professor of creative writing at Arizona State University. She earned an MFA in poetry at the University of Virginia and her PhD in literature and creative writing from the University of Southern California. Yes, the other USC. She's also an award-winning poet and author. Her first full-length poetry collection, Cannibal, was published in 2016 and won numerous awards. Her debut memoir, How to Say Babylon, which she'll talk about today, has received rave reviews. And I read a description of it as it was described as a banquet for its sheer lusciousness of prose. How about that? She's the oldest of 4. She has 3 younger siblings, a younger brother, 2 sisters, and she grew up in a pretty, I would call it, draconian, at least authoritarian, Rastafarian household. Her father was a reggae musician who adhered to a very strict Rastafarian belief imposed on the entire household, and especially the female members, including her mother. Those beliefs dictated what Safiya could wear, who she could see, where she could go, which was almost no one outside of the family and almost nowhere. And I read a Time magazine article in which she once said, quote, "I spent most of my girlhood under a kind of silence. I kept most of my thoughts and dreams, along with my curiosity, pressed like secret petals between the pages of my notebook." Well, it was because of these alienating experiences that she turned to poetry. And so to answer the question, who is Safiya Sinclair, to me requires peeling back several layers. And we're fortunate to have Dr. Tamara Butler in conversation with Dr. Sinclair to help us do that. Dr. Butler is the executive director of the Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture at the College of Charleston. She has roots in the Low Country, I think Johns Island, and she's a first-generation college graduate with degrees from Ohio State and Xavier University. She's a former assistant professor at Michigan State University, and her research connected to Black Girl Land project, documenting Black women's connections to land, memory, and community, is what brought her back to the South Carolina Sea Islands. She continues to focus on initiatives centering on equity, responsibility, accessibility, and education, and community engagement. Finally, before turning the program over to Dr. Butler and Dr. Sinclair, I want to thank Kay Bachman as sponsor for this session, and Dr. Butler, Dr. Sinclair, the floor is yours. Thank you.
We made it.
Yes, yeah.
We're here. I'm going to say what I also said when I had the honor of talking to Dr. Perry, Imani Perry. I'm fangirling in my seat because I love Dr. Sinclair's work. I first encountered it when I was teaching students at Michigan State, and we looked at Cannibal. And so, of course, we're going to start the conversation there. But before we go any further, I just want to say thank you for this work. And I also want to say thank you for the inspiration. Today's outfit is brought to you in part by the cover of the book. And so we're going to talk a little bit about cover art. I've been tracking Dr. Sinclair's wardrobe on her book tour. And so I was like, I can't go up here looking any kind of way. I got to try to match the energy here. So thank you for setting the bar so high. All right.
I love that. Thank you for being on theme.
No problem, do what I can. All right, so one of the things we want to get into is we're going to get to how to say Babylon, but I'm going to start where I like to start is Cannibal. So could you tell us a little bit about that text and what was it like writing it?
Sure, yeah. Well, thanks. First of all, thank you all for being here. I'm very happy to be here. This is my first time in Charleston. I love a town by the sea as an island girl myself, so happy. And thank you, Dr. Butler, and for everyone at the Literary Festival for having me. For those who don't know, Cannibal is my debut poetry collection. I wrote most of the poems in Cannibal when I was getting my master's at the University of Virginia. So I was living in Charlottesville. I had just come from Jamaica in a way that felt for the first time in my life that it was final, like there was some finality in my leaving. And so when I got to Charlottesville, there were a lot of, open wounds that I was experiencing that I felt also was connected to being just living in Charlottesville also. When I got there, I would say, oh, we're in the South, and people in Charlottesville would be like, we're not in the South.
But where were we then?
And I was like, are we not in the South? Like, when I arrived, the statue of Robert E. Lee was still in the park. It was a different Charlottesville, and people talked about they referred to Thomas Jefferson as TJ without irony, people, if they were gonna think of erecting a new building on campus, they would say, what would TJ want? What would TJ think? And I would just think, where am I? Like, where have I come to?
Right.
But as a poet, inevitably, my way of answering these questions was on the page. And so I found myself writing a lot of poems about, being a Caribbean person living in Charlottesville, Virginia. Yeah. And so a lot of Cannibal was born out of that, of making sense of the place I was in, trying to trace these colonial wounds, the wounds of empire, while also thinking about Jamaica and writing about homesickness and about family and about, Jamaican womanhood.
Thank you. So I like the transition because most of us, well, I was saying for myself, I came to you as a poet. And so to make that transition, in an interview you said you didn't make a switch, right? Because somebody asked you, like, what was it like to make that switch from being a poet to a memoir? But you said it was an expansion.
Yes.
So could you tell us a little bit more about what that process was like?
Yeah, I get asked that question and I'm just like, I think people want me to say, oh yes, now I'm totally different. I am a memoirist, but I'm the same. I'm a poet,
Right.
And for me, a lot of the themes that I write about in the memoir and How to Say Babylon are similar to what I write about in my poetry. I write a lot about family. I write about Jamaica, Jamaican girlhood. I write about the landscape. The Jamaican landscape is where I draw inspiration from for how I construct my sentences. And that was the same when I was writing the memoir. So when I say it's an expansion, it's very much expanding on a lot of the themes that I already wrote about in my poetry or think about in my poetry. But the memoir just allowed me to do different things or tell the story in a different way. In writing the memoir, I could now write dialogue, which I never did in my poetry. I had to think about characterization. How am I going to present my family members as full-blooded people on the page? I had to think about language and scene making and world building. So, it allowed me to flex some muscles as a writer that I never did before in poetry. Yeah.
Thank you. So you mentioned family. So how did you negotiate who gets in the book, whose stories get to be told? How did that work out with family?
I mean, all of my family's in the book. Yeah, so they're all in the book. I think maybe some people in my life, on the fringes, are probably wondering why they're not in the book.
Right,
But,
right.
But my family is very close knit, so it was important to me that I presented them in a way that the reader would be able to feel my love for them from the page, and also that when they open the book, that they would see themselves there and it would feel familiar to them and it wouldn't feel like I told the story in a way that was alien to them. So when I was writing it, I called my family all the time and asked them about their own memories to see how it overlapped with mine or it didn't, and actually I found ways to interweave everybody's memories into one in the book.
Yeah.
So it's a collective telling of our lives.
I like that. Reading it, because I'm going to be transparent, I'm not done reading. I'm halfway through, all right? So
You should just pretend.
right? No, we gotta be honest. I'm trying to be vulnerable up here. You were very vulnerable in the text, and I appreciate that. And I've been listening to a lot of different conversations that people have been having with you, and so I'm always fascinated of how people are vulnerable. But in reading it, it also reminds me of my own family and how we kind of just gather under the tree and tell stories around family reunion. And so my aunt's memories become memories, my brother's memories, so I appreciate that kind of collective telling. So I'm going to back up a little bit because it's a memoir,
Yeah.
which is a little different than an autobiography, but I think about Margot Perkins. So she did this whole work around activists writing their autobiographies, and she said she explores the way that writing functions for each of the women that she's studying as an act of self-recovery and reconciliation with the past. Do you see that for your own work as an act of self-recovery and reconciliation of the past?
I love that. Yes, I do. You know, I wanted to be able to write the memoir in a way that I felt that it could be a kind of agent for change in my family and a currency for healing in my family. And so it was important to me to be able to be in that space in my life to even begin writing the memoir. I was adamant that I didn't want to write the memoir from a place of hurt, from a wound.
Right.
And so it took me a long time to actually get to that place. Actually, when I was in Charlottesville, I had a professor, a poet named Gregory Orr, he told me that I needed to write the memoir from a place of safety. And when I was in Charlottesville, he said, I don't think you have that place of safety yet. And he was right. And so I also think about, when I sat down to write it, I thought about, well, I do want to make a record of our lives, of my family's lives, to say, this is what real Jamaican people's lives are like, beyond this idea of a postcard paradise. I also want to give people an idea of what Jamaican girlhood looks like, or what a Rastafari girl's life might look like. I think most people, when they think about Rastafari, they have, I think, maybe kind of a narrow view.
Right.
You know, they maybe think of the brethren or the men, and they probably think of one particular man, but nobody ever really thinks about, well, what is a young Rasta girl's life like? And so it was important for me to also expand the sort of global imagination about what that looks like. But then, you know, more particularly to me, I thought about what I was giving to my family. Not just to say to other readers that, yes, we lived, our lives mattered, and it's worth writing down in literature. But also I thought about what I was leaving to whoever comes next. And so I thought a lot about my niece when I began writing the book, and what I wanted to give her. And Audre Lorde has this quote where she says, poetry is the bridge across our fears to what has never been before. And I began to think about the book not just as a way of looking back into the past of Jamaica's history, of my family's history, but also writing toward the future, that the book itself could be a bridge to the future, so that my niece would not only know where she came from, but that she would know that the future was hers entirely for the making.
I love that. So at Avery, we usually talk a lot about the Sankofa symbol, as it's been built into a lot of Philip Simmons' gates and some of the artwork we have. And so to me, and we also know the Sankofa bird, we honor her as a woman, as a female entity. And so I think it's really beautiful because I kind of see you as like this beautiful Sankofa bird, kind of, in your book is that kind of bringing the past into the present and into the future. So thank you for that, of thinking about what we can share. And so in that, they're also thinking about text. We were talking about that you've mentioned that there's no actual text for Rastafari, right? That there's no book, there's no Bible, so there's no written history.
There's none, yeah.
So how does
Most people are surprised to know that, right? And so when I sat down to write the book, I was like, okay, this is a lot of pressure, right? Because there's no foundational text that I could cross-reference. There's no like one unified view of Rastafari faith or Rastafari liberty. So, you know, there was some difficulties to getting it right, essentially. And so I did a lot of research where I talked to, you know, like in the Caribbean, our oral histories are still very much the way that we preserve a lot of where we come from. And so I had to really turn to oral histories. I had to ask my father, ask my brother, ask other Rasta brethren to tell me, okay, what are the tenets of Rastafari? What are the different sects of Rastafari? Because a lot of this wisdom, you guessed it, is only passed down from brethren to brethren. A lot of women are not really invited into the circle of reasoning and having these tenets of Rastafari passed down. So, and when I was a young girl, I would wonder, like, well, why am I not invited into the circle of reasoning? So I think it's interesting now that I am the storyteller of the family and that I actually, I am the one who is writing it down. So I did a lot of oral history. I talked to my parents extensively about their connection to Rastafari. And then I did a lot of archival research of just putting scenes together. So, you know, there's a scene where Haile Selassie visits Jamaica for the first time. He's the Ethiopian emperor that a lot of Rastafari see as a godhead figure, a messiah. And so he visited Jamaica in the 60s, and I knew I had to write that scene. Because, it's, you know, really the truth is stranger than fiction. You know, it's almost too mythic to believe, but it's such a large part of Rastafari folklore that I had to write the scene. And so I was going back reading like old Jamaican newspapers, old like Life magazines, and putting the scene back together just from these different sources. So yeah, you know, I felt like a magpie, like pulling from everywhere, trying to put it all together in a way that would feel like a congruous telling of history to the reader, but also like I knew what I was talking about. Yeah. Which now I do. Now, strangely enough, like I'm like a Rastafari scholar from scratch.
We love that. I mean, I think that it's dynamic in the sense of that you are doing the research, right?
Yes.
Like that it's taking the research, you know, Toni Morrison talks about the kind of interior.
Yeah.
And so I think you also give us that. So it's like the archives and they have these fragments you put together, and then you also give us a little sneak peek into the insides of people's lives.
Yeah.
And what people are thinking. So thank you for that. So when you said that, it made me think about this. There was a conversation. Oh, the one thing I wanted to pick up on is, so Rastafari is informed by Ethiopia, but why? Like, how does that happen? How does it make this jump from Jamaica to Ethiopia and back?
Yeah. And it's not even necessarily informed by Ethiopia. It's informed by, Jamaica was a colony of Britain for a very long time. Well, first they were a colony of Spain, and then we were a colony of Britain for hundreds of years. We're not going to get into that right now. But we got our independence in 1962. But in the early 1930s is when the Rastafari movement began, because Jamaica was still under British colonial rule. The black citizens of Jamaica wanted their own agency. They wanted liberty. They wanted, freedom to kind of make their own futures. And we had a Pan-Africanist abolitionist, Marcus Garvey, who in one of his final speeches said, "Look to Africa for the crowning of a black king, for he shall be the redeemer." And there was a street preacher in Jamaica who heard this speech from Marcus Garvey. And this happened around the same time that Haile Selassie was coronated in Ethiopia. And he was the only black ruler in the world at the time. And Ethiopia was the only African nation to never be colonized. And so when Leonard Howell, the street preacher, saw this, he said, "This is the man. This is him. This is the Messiah." And so Howell is the one who is known as the first Rasta, the founder of the Rastafari movement. And the inspiration that Haile Selassie presented to black people at the time was what the Rastafari movement hardened around, this black king in Africa, in a nation that was never colonized. It served as an aspirational motivation for black people in Jamaica at the time, and that's where the movement began, and it kind of hardened around this man who then became myth and mountain and Messiah. who himself was an Orthodox Christian. So when he came to Jamaica and he met the Rastafari, he said, I am not God, I am just a man. But the Rastafari said only God would deny his divinity.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Holly was working real hard. He was like, no.
Yeah, only God would be like, I'm not God. So that was proof.
I mean, the thing so often, the one thing that we think about in Rastafari is we think about the men. And so I appreciate the fact that we're focused on women and also the interior. So really, could you tell us, I mean, this book is really kind of, you spring forward a lot about your mother in this text. And so is there anything that you want to share with us about, you know, that process of getting to know more about yourself and your mom's relationship through this process?
Sure. I mean, I could talk about my mother all day, which she would love. She, you know, is the person who first gave me and my siblings our love of language and our love of literature. She had always been an educator my whole life, self-taught. And she created for me and my siblings our own like after-school curriculum where she would have us like memorize and recite poetry and like make our own songs and paint. And she would take us on nature walks where she would point out to me the name of every plant, every flower, the name of every tree. And when I was writing the book, it occurred to me that my mother was, with all the things she was doing when I was younger, she was making me into a poet. Like she had given me all the tools that I needed to be the poet that I am. And she was also the one when I was around 10 years old who handed me my first collection of poems. And you know, I was having a tough time at school. I had a friend who I thought was my friend and she said, I don't want to be your friend anymore because I don't want to be friends with a Rasta. And that was the first time I felt such hurt of being rejected because I was a Rastafari. And I harmed myself. And my mother knew, somehow she knew. And she handed me that book of poems and she said, poetry was always the thing that made her world wide and wild and warmer. And then she said, that's alliteration. And I said, what is alliteration? And then, you know, the damage was done from there, you know? Like after that, poetry for me was the thing that I used as my foremost way of expressing myself, of understanding the world, of processing the things that happened to me. It was also the place where I began to nurture a voice in a house where I felt that I was voiceless. And so I often say that not only was poetry for me always an act of survival, but that I would not be here today without my mother. And I wouldn't be a poet without her. And you know, that's actually literally true. So she loves to say, I just can't believe I have my own personal poet. Like to her, I'm just her poet, you know?
I mean, you are.
And, you know, she comes to my readings and I'll look down in the front and I see her like mouthing the words to my poems. And it's just too cute. So
I love that. I love that. So when you say that, I think about, I have former students who share similar stories where they're like their mother is their first person to hand them poetry. And so now that you are a professor of writing, what kind of poems and
allegedly,
poets? You mean you are, not allegedly. That's the title on the website.
That's true.
So what are some poets, who are some poets that you introduce your students to?
You know, I like to do a lot of course correcting. And I'll tell you what I mean. When I was a student, you know, so I've done a lot of schooling. You heard my introduction, like that was a lot. It's too much maybe. But I came to the US and I got my bachelor's degree, then I got my master's degree, and then I got my doctorate at the other USC, apparently. And in all those years of tertiary schooling, when I looked back and I thought about it, I had only encountered 1 or 2 writers of color in over a decade of college. And I was like, how can this be? How can this be? So a lot of the poets that I came to on my own. I had to do the work on my own. And so as a professor, I try to correct, decolonize the canon is the fancy way of saying it. But I want to make sure that my students know that poetry is alive. It's mercurial, it's happening, it's, they're living poets. And so it's important for me that they know it's not just dead white guys, and that I can sort of expand their view of what poetry is like so they too feel like they can add to, the dialogue.
I like that.
And a lot of them, especially the undergrads that I teach, I can see the light coming on in their face when they're like, oh, you mean it's not all like The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost?
No.
No, girl, like there's a lot more out here. So I love to teach, I teach Audre Lorde every class. I teach Lucille Clifton, but I also teach contemporary poets like Dinez Smith. I teach Paul Tran. So I try to make sure I cover a wide range of literary voices, and also poets who are not just American, because I think I want to expand their idea of literature to world literature as well, and myself as someone who's not an American writer. And so, yeah, it's important for me, for my students to have an expansive view of the canon. And also, we read the foundational texts too, which I think some people, I've had students come in and, why am I reading Walt Whitman? Or like, why am I reading Keats? And I'm like, well, girl, you gotta know the foundations of the house if you're gonna burn it.
Oh, I like that.
So, yeah.
I'm gonna borrow that one. So when you said that, it made me think about, so Imani Perry, if you all have the hardback or not, she gives this beautiful kind of endorsement, but she puts you in the pantheon of Caribbean writers. So whether it's Paul Marshall, Jamaica Kincaid, and Edwidge Dandicott. So, is there anyone else?
Which to me is already just like surreal. Because first of all, I love Imani Perry. Like, she's an amazing writer, scholar, thinker. I'm a stan of Imani Perry, right? But then for her to say, I'm in this tradition of Caribbean writers, I mean, I was speechless when she wrote that about the book.
Yeah.
So you're asking me who else?
I mean,
That's good enough for me. You can put that on my tombstone.
There you go. I mean, I just think about it. You're right. I never thought about the fact, it's like, this is, like, I'm overwhelmed by the fact that the person I admire thinks that I should be in this category with people I also admire.
Yeah. So yeah, I feel very grateful to even be read by her and to be seen in that way. And, those are amazing writers and writers that I admire and look up to.
Yes. So I'm going to jump one more time back into the island of Jamaica.
Yeah.
And ask a little bit if there are any writers, because in the audience I know we have some teachers and students and people who think that Jamaica Kincaid is from Jamaica, right? So we also have that.
I know she's tired of people asking that, right? Yeah.
So who also have that? But if there are any writers who also introduce us to Jamaica in some ways that you've been thinking about, whether poets or prose writers or fiction writers.
There's a novelist, Nicole Dennis Benn, who writes about Jamaica, writes about Jamaican women, writes about the tourism industry in Jamaica. Her first novel is called Here Comes the Sun. I highly recommend that. Of course, we have Marlon James, who writes about Jamaica. He writes about Kingston mostly, you know. We have Erna Broadbur, who's a Jamaican novelist. We have a poet named Shara McCollum, who is a gorgeous writer. We have a theorist, Sylvia Winter,
There you go.
who for me is also like foundational in thinking about post-colonial identity, which I always think about in everything that I write.
Thank you. I'm making a small syllabus in my mind at the same time of like, I should be reading this, this, and this.
Yeah.
And so, let me see, I got a couple more minutes. I got like 5. I have 5 more minutes of my own questions. So I'm gonna get into questions that I also want to ask, because you talked about writing from a place of safety.
Yeah.
But I'm also really curious about, what does your writing look like? Like, what does the process look like? Do you sit on the couch with some tea? Do you go for a walk? Are you a verbal note taker? Like, what does writing look like for you?
You know, I'm always like protective of talking about my writing
Okay.
practice, but I will tell you, a lot of it happens late at night. I write, my hours of writing are from like 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. So like, yes, the audible gasp.
Right, it's like, what?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, so I literally write in the witching hour. A lot of my writing happens in bed. You know, I wish I were the poet to be like, I get up every morning, I go to my desk, and
Right.
No,
Open the blind.
but I think because I began writing at such a young age, at 10, I wrote my first poem, published my first poem at 16, and I lived in this house with all these siblings, and it was always kind of like chaotic. The only time I had to myself to really think about the poem or kind of nurture the self on the page was when everybody in my house was asleep. And so that's how I first began writing my poems, like late at night when everyone was asleep, sitting in my bed, and that just became my safe space. That I need to feel somehow that I am the only person awake in the world for the words to come. And then particularly my poetry, the process of writing is very unique, or it's
Okay.
like very particular, where I carry around the first line of a poem with me in my head. Before I write it down, I'll like have it in my head, I'll say it over and over in my head for like a week, every day, every day, every day. If it stays, I'll write it down. If it evaporates, that means it wasn't ready. And then once I write down that first line, the rest of the poem comes in like a very feverish moment. It feels like the muse just touches my head and the poem comes in like a couple hours. And then I'll spend, you know, a few days or a week revising. But most of my poems come in this very intense, feverish way. And then I spend most of the day reading the poem out loud. So when I used to have neighbors, like I used to have a neighbor above me, I knew they must have thought I was crazy, because I would just walk around my house and I'd be saying the poem over and over and over to kind of find the places where I felt there wasn't enough energy in the line, or I needed to shift a word or a different word, or it needed to be a longer line or a shorter line, or I could feel where the power was collecting or the energy was collecting in the poem. And so that's my poetic process.
Okay.
When I sat down to write the memoir, it turns out you can't write a memoir like that. So
just
it
about to
turns out you
ask.
can't write 350 pages like that.
No.
So I had to really be disciplined in my practice and not just wait for the poem to appear and the muse to touch my head. I had to like outline the chapters and think
No.
about dialogue, think about narrative arcs, think about scenes. You know, it was an entirely different practice that I had to be attentive to every day, working at it. But I still wrote from 11 a.m. to 6 a.m.
Oh, gosh. No, I don't know how you do it. I usually tap out after about an hour. Hence the reason why my book is still in progress. So we'll get there. So before we turn it over to the audience, do we have any questions from the audience? Okay. So before we turn it over to the audience, I will give this instructions. There will be a mic coming around. So when the mic reaches you, that's when you can pose your question to our lovely distinguished guests here. And make sure it's a question, not a statement. Because I don't like to interrupt people, but I will.
Unless it's a statement on like my outfit.
Right. Yeah. We only take praise on this stage. So I think the one last question I ask, because I think it's such a beautiful cover, but I also noticed that there's two different covers.
Oh, where is it?
I don't know. So there's this cover, which is with the yellow scissors and the locks. But then I saw online that there was another cover with a photo on the front.
That's the UK cover.
Okay. So do y'all get to decide which
There's
country?
also a Dutch cover that's a different cover.
How do you decide who gets what cover?
They decide.
Okay.
Then they ask me and I say yes or no.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
All right. I've always been curious about
So
that.
the UK, they decided they wanted a photo of me as a child on the cover because they're like, this is what will connect with UK readers. In the Netherlands, they wanted a photo of me as an adult on the cover. And I was like, okay, that's fine.
Sure.
You know, I'm biased, like I think that's cool. And then, the US, I think was the one that we had, I really took them through the ringer months and months.
Really?
To arrive at this cover. But in the end, I think, yeah, I like it. I like it.
I like it too.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm gonna open it up to questions. We got two over here and two over there.
I see a lot of hands.
Wave your hands in the air.
Yes.
There we go. And let us know who you are.
Jackie McLemore Martin. I loved the book.
Thank you.
So just one statement and two questions. One is, I'm wondering about the kind of legacy of the old poet, how that has sort of settled in with you as over these many years.
Yeah.
And also the girls that you went to high school with. There was a lot of meanness and exclusion.
Yeah.
And it's now been 20 years or so since then.
Yeah.
I don't know if you hear from any of them or how they're impacted by
Yeah,
what
yeah.
you've written and what you've done.
I think, a lot of them were like, we were friends. It's like, were we? Were we? But all their names have been changed, so it's for them to sit with. The old poet. For those of you who haven't read the book, this is a poetry mentor I had when I was younger. When I was 16, I'd sent in my poems to the national newspaper, and he was the editor there, and he called me and he said, we have to work together, you're very talented. And from 16 to, I think, 19, we spent a lot of time together working on my poems. And it began in a positive way. And then I think it did not end that way, without spoiling anything. Writing about it, it was important for me to write about it, first of all, because he was my first connection to poetry, and he taught me a lot about the foundations of poetry, and was the first person who made me feel like what I had to say was important. After a very long time growing up in a household where women were told their highest virtue was their silence and their obedience. So then going from that to being a poet who's like published nationally in the newspaper, it was a big difference, but it also gave me my confidence. But then I had to write about the nuance of when that turns into something different, where I thought for the first time that I was being embraced and admired for my mind, but then I was preyed upon for my body, right? So, yeah, I don't know, you asked how I've settled with it. There's a point in the book, I'll tell you through what I've written in the book, where I wrote a poem for him, and he said, I will not discuss this poem with you. And I said, well, why not? He said, my worst fear is being written about. So there you go. Who has the last word?
Thank you so much for this gift. It's just a beautiful, beautiful book.
Thank you.
When I was reading it, I was thinking, boy, I don't know anything about Rastafarian culture.
Yeah.
And when you said, well, there really aren't history books on it
Yeah.
and nowhere to go, I'm curious, why do you think that is?
Because the Rastafari kind of reject, you know, a lot of societal norms. They reject anything that is tied to, I mean, this idea of Babylon for them, right, is anything that is opposite to what they believe, anything connected to Western ideology, to systemic racism, to capitalism, colonialism, what they call ism and schism. This is what the Rastafari call it. They reject that. And so for them, similarly, like when I was trying to figure out how many Rastafari exist in Jamaica, and there's like these, you know, census records, and it's like, a lot of Rastafari don't even talk to the census taker because that's Babylon, right? So this idea of also writing a history book or talking to a historian that's not Rastafari is antithetical to what they believe. They believe that the wisdom of Rastafari is passed down from brethren to brethren or through reggae music. To them, reggae music is the primary way of sharing the message of Rastafari, which I think a lot of people also don't realize, that reggae music is actually the Rastafari's form of prayer and gospel, like sharing what they believe. That's reggae music, yeah.
Hi, I'm Barbara Caver. I'm visiting
Hi.
from New York, actually. Just wanted to say that. I have a question regarding the moment that you arrived at the place of safety to write this memoir.
Yes. Do you know the moment? Oh. You said it like, tell me about that moment. You know, it was, let's see, maybe 5 years ago. And I had went back home for the first time after being away for a very, very long time. And I went to a festival in Jamaica, one of actually the biggest festivals in the world in the Caribbean, called Calabash Literary Festival. And I encourage you all to go because it's amazing. So I went back and I read my poems. You know, I was going to read my poems at home for the very first time. And I invited my father to come and hear me read after being estranged for quite some time. And he came, he was like in the audience, like in the first or second row. And the whole day I was preparing this speech of what I was gonna say to him before I read a poem for him as like my final poem. That was like the first time I'm just gonna express to him everything I'd been thinking my whole life in public. And I said, before I read the poem, I said, Father, I just want you to hear me. Yeah, I just want you to hear me. And I read the poem for him, and then I got off the stage, you know, and I just remember him embracing me, and he whispered in my ear, I'm listening, and I hear you. And that was the moment that I had that place of safety, that I felt for the first time that I was ready to write the book. I felt so much had been lifted from me in that moment. A lot of the burdens had been lifted from me, and I felt, now I can begin because I know where it ends.
I enjoyed an interview you had on YouTube where you were asked about your father in the book, and
Yes.
you said you gave him a copy of the book, but you didn't know at that time whether he had read it or not. And I was wondering if you could give us an update.
Unfortunately, I don't have an update.
Okay.
I think, he asked me for a copy, and it was the first thing he ever asked me to read that I had written. And this was this summer in August. And as soon as he started reading the book, he kept calling my phone. He was blowing up my phone. And so I answered the phone. Yes, Dad. He's like, oh, like right here, you said I was born in the countryside, but I was born in Victoria Jubilee Hospital at 5 p.m. And I was like, okay, but then you went home to the country, like that's where you lived in the countryside, right? Like, well, yes, kind of. And so he was calling with all these minute things, and I said, can you just promise me something? Can you promise me that we don't talk about the book till you finish it? Yeah. And that was our last conversation.
Got a hand in the back. Because I can ask questions too. Oh, in the front.
My name is Isabella, and I'm from North Carolina with the rest of most of these students. I was wondering what advice you could give to young female writers who maybe aren't sure if their voice will be heard.
I think even if you're not sure that your voice is going to be heard, I think you have to trust your voice anyway, and keep writing, keep, working at it. Read everything, read widely, read voraciously, and trust the voice. Trust that your voice and your, I think a lot about my younger self, and I wrote this book for her, and for you, for girls like you, because there were times where I felt also that my voice didn't matter, that what I had to say didn't matter, that I didn't matter. But when I think a lot about writing the book, and when I was writing it, I realized that it was my younger self who saved me. It wasn't anybody else. It was she who saved me. She, in fact, saved herself because she believed in herself, and she kept writing, and she kept going. And so that's what I would say, that your words do matter, and I want to hear what you have to say.
My name is Renee. I'm so glad you're here today. And I want to know if, because of Rastafarians' connection, because of their belief that their king and redeemer was in Ethiopia, looking at as their Mecca, if people made pilgrimages to Ethiopia.
Oh yeah,
particularly from the 30s
absolutely.
now.
A lot of Rastafari believe, so they call Africa Zion, particularly Ethiopia, they call Zion. Their wish is to repatriate to Africa. And so there are a lot of Rastafari who actually repatriate to Ethiopia. And the Ethiopian government has actually gifted some land to Rastafari to come back. It's called Shashamani in Ethiopia. So there is actually now a big Rastafari population on Shashamani land in Ethiopia. Yeah. Any other question? One last question?
One last question. Oh, we got one last question right here. This is it. You are it. Woo!
Hi, I'm Sanskar Deva. Kind of just a quick general question.
Yeah.
So with how rich Jamaican culture is, especially in the music aspect, with your dad growing up being a reggae musician, how do you think music, specifically reggae music in this case, impacted you or your writing or your creativity, and just how that relationship is?
Thank you. That's a great question. Music played a very big part in my life growing up. Because my father was a musician, we were a very musical family. Every morning, began with the sound of my father's guitar strumming, and he was writing a song. My siblings and I once had a family band where we wrote our own songs about saving the environment. And we traveled around Jamaica, like performing these songs actually in like high schools and different venues. And we had a couple bands after that. Then it was like a punk band. Like, I think a lot of the time we did the opposite of what our father wanted us to do. So it wasn't a reggae band, it was like an emo punk band, But, music has always played a large part in our lives, and in my poetry in particular. I was just describing my process of how I read the poems out loud over and over. Part of that is ensuring that the music exists in the poem when it's spoken out loud, not just on the page, so that any reader who picks up my poem, don't just read it on the page, say it, embody it, because it's supposed to feel like a song, it's supposed to feel like an incantation. And I similarly in the memoir wanted the sentences to sing, And so I think a lot about the music that's inside of the writing, inside of the lines, as fundamental to the work itself being successful. And reggae music in particular, I've been thinking a lot about my next poetry collection, and that is going to be more informed by reggae music and Rastafari vernacular in a more active way. Because the Rastafari, they have their own unique way of speaking, which is born out of anti-colonial ideology, which is about uprooting English language. So the Rastafari, they don't like to say anything negative, or they don't like anything. So they don't say, for example, they don't say understand. A Rasta brethren say overstand. And they don't say appreciate, they say appreciate love. And my father doesn't say continually, he says itinually. And so they have this like very interesting way of speaking that I, as a poet, find particularly intriguing, and I've been thinking about ways that I can interact with this anti-colonial linguistic rebellion on the page, but also bloom a femininity and a womanhood from a place where I wasn't always allowed to be. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sinclair and Dr. Butler. This was just a fascinating discussion. The book is amazing. It will be for sale out in the room where the box office is, and Dr. Sinclair will be signing copies, personalizing copies. And I just want to say what a joy it is to have you as part of the Literary Festival, and thank you again.